Creator, we give you thanks for the stories of our faith that have been handed down to us throughout the generations. We give you thanks for those who first shared them with us and helped us to wrestle and grapple with the implications of ancient words held in tension with our current reality. Help us to recognize that there is more than enough to go around. More than enough love, more than enough food, more than enough resources, so that all of your people may live a life of abundance in you. Bless, O God, the words of my mouth, the hearts and minds and souls of them that hear them, and will help turn them into action as we move through seeing as believing and into believing as seeing. Amen. It might seem a little strange if you haven't been part of this series that we started on the first Sunday of Advent, that we're already reading the story of the birth of Jesus and what happens immediately afterwards. Today we're talking about what happens in the present, in this moment. Last week we talked about what happens in the past and how that can form and shape and mold our current reality, sometimes for the good and sometimes to the detriment. We started off by talking about the chains that limit us and hold us back, the chains that need to be broken in order for us to fully enter into this God among us, indwelling in fleshed moment that we remember at Christmas. And so today we've shifted along with Scrooge from A Christmas Carol to the second ghost or spirit that visits him, the ghost of Christmas present. The one that calls Scrooge to look upon him and see the reality of the current present time. Not like the previous one who came and visited him, which seemed ethereal and kind of distant, but close at hand, but not quite there. This is a very present moment. Scrooge can smell the food, can almost touch the people. This is real. This moment right here. And when you compare that with the story that we read from Matthew, you begin to understand what Matt Rawle is getting at when he says these words in his book. Jesus' birth is the eye of a storm that continues to turn the world upside down. He came so that we might discover and share abundant and everlasting life. If you think about the story that Maria read from Matthew's Gospel, Jesus is born. We have all the associations that we celebrate at Christmas time. It's a wonderful thing. It's a miraculous kind of thing. It changes the course of human history forever. And very quickly thereafter, the Magi show up, and Joseph and Mary are told they need to get going. The storm that will be the life of Jesus and the teaching of Jesus has already started. There was this one brief moment, but other things are already starting to shift. Fear is already starting to win out. And the only way that things can unfold is for them to leave. It's another piece that Rawle comments on around the first nativity, where he says, at its heart, the first nativity is a story born out of poverty, where scarcity is transformed into abundance by a God who will stop at nothing to be with us. If you think about the situation of Jesus' birth and the condition of his mother and father, of his parents, then it's easy to see that it really is a story born out of poverty. And when the Magi show up, everything has changed. Gold, frankincense, myrrh, that is enough to transform somebody's physical, emotional, spiritual, financial reality. It's a sudden transformation from scarcity to abundance. And even the direction to go and flee into Egypt is a continuation of this story of transformation that begins with the birth of Jesus. The story that helps us now move from fear to hope, to peace, to love, and even joy. It's one of the challenges that confronts us. Speaking about this kind of passage, Basil of Caesarea, he comments on it like this: "The bread which you have set aside is the bread of the hungry. This garment you have locked away is the clothing of the naked. Those shoes which you let rot are the shoes of those who are barefoot. Those riches you have hoarded are the riches of the poor." Basil is trying to get us to grapple with what happens when we believe in scarcity and how that forces us to constrict and hold on to and pull away from and move inward out of fear. Ultimately, that's what happens when we do those things, when we keep the food, when we keep the garments, when our closets are overflowing, when we have more shoes than we could ever wear, when our bank accounts are so large there's no way to spend all the money. What we've done is given into a sense of fear and scarcity and hoarded everything in. And the reality of it is that when we do that, we prevent others from experiencing the abundance that God has promised. We prevent others from experiencing the transformation that is real and possible in the world if we are willing to risk having ourselves transformed. In many ways, it's the same parallel as A Christmas Carol and Scrooge. Scrooge has pulled everything in. The whole first part of the story is how much he hates giving away any money. When Marley dies and is buried and the coins are placed on his eyes, Scrooge pays for the funeral services and then goes over and reclaims the 2 coins. So he's not actually out any money. The dead don't need it after all, he says. With Cratchit, he constantly complains about him wanting a day off for Christmas and how that's taking advantage of him for paying wages for a day with no work. He constantly laments the joy of his nephew and how Christmas never put any gold or silver in his pocket. For Scrooge, there is never enough. It's always about gathering more and more and more. And it means that as he walks about the roads of life, he isn't fully engaged in the present. He's always got his eye on future gains, on future investments, on future returns, and he misses life in that way. He misses the experiences that are happening all around him, to the point where in some of the movies, as he walks down the streets, people see him coming and flee and run away. Such is the self-centeredness of Scrooge. But he doesn't just do that with his financial resources. He does that with his emotional resources as well. Scrooge has felt pain in his heart, and he contracts every relationship around him so that he risks never being hurt again. Joy is not something he shares with others or himself. Love is not something that moves outside of his very small circle. Peace, hope, they're so contained that they're stifled. That's the challenge that comes to us this Advent as we read the stories of what happens when Jesus is born. We begin to recognize that many of the same conditions continue to exist today in us and in others if we're honest when we look in the mirror. The phrase goes, there's a little bit of Scrooge in all of us, and that is true. The question as we move through Advent becomes, how much Scrooge? And do we let that part of us, that side of us, the piece that really wants to grab a hold of fear, that wants to find security in the fear, do we let that piece become dominant? Or do we instead focus on hope and joy and peace? That's the challenge that comes us. And now during this pandemic tide, it's really easy to give into that fear. That notion that there's a virus out there somewhere just waiting to grab us and make us sick and perhaps even kill us, and then infect all of our loved ones or people we've come into contact with. Fear that if we're around somebody else, we might die. Yes, we need to take the pandemic serious. I'm not suggesting anything different. But fear can immobilize us and can draw us so far inside ourselves that we forget that the God we worship and the person we follow as the Christ wasn't about fear and scarcity. They're about abundance and joy. Eventually, as Scrooge works through the visit with the ghost of Christmas present, he starts to realize, maybe for the first time, what the spirit of Christmas really is. It's a glimmer of hope in a hurting world. That's the story of Jesus. Even when Jesus and his family move into Egypt, it's not because God needs to protect them or save them. If that were the case, then that raises very serious questions about what kind of God saves one family but leaves all the other children under the age of 2 to be executed and murdered. Rather, God sends Jesus into Egypt with his family not to protect him, but to redeem another part of the story. Jesus is sent with his family into the land of slavery that was historically associated with the flee from slavery and persecution. That was the association of Egypt, and all of a sudden, when Jesus goes there and comes back later on, Egypt itself is redeemed. That part of the narrative is redeemed. It is transformed from a story of fear and anxiety and scarcity into one of abundance and hope and joy. The very movement changes the story. And that's really what this Advent season is trying to help us wrestle with and grapple with. Where are the stories in our own lives that need to be redeemed, that need to be transformed, where the narrative needs to be shifted from one of fear and anxiety and scarcity to one of abundance and hope and joy? Our inquiries, conversations, to a certain degree, are all about that transformation of what it means when we say the full breadth of the human experience and the diversity of the divinity of God invested in human form is welcomed and celebrated as it is embodied and enfleshed right here every time we gather. And here's the thing. God delivers the good news to the shepherds, not because they were the best equipped to spread the news, or that they were nearby and it was convenient. It's because God was already there with the unlikely. God is already here with us. God is already moving in this community, moving in our ministry, moving in our connections, moving in the way we embody the gospel of Christ in the world. God is already here, and I guarantee you, God is up to something. And we're the most unlikely. And it's not because we're the most convenient or because we're even the best equipped, but it's because God is already here and active in this community, helping us transition from a perception of scarcity to one of abundance. And that's what happens when you let Christ into your life and into your networks and relationships, the Christ transforms fear itself into the embodiment of hope. Into the embodiment that tomorrow can be different, will be different, could be different. That there is enough in the world for all of us. We just have to adjust how we engage with one another. There is a way to change the narrative of fear and scarcity to one of abundance and hope and joy. And the question is, dare we sing the song of joy in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of a world filled with fear, in the midst of a world where 300,000 people will have died of COVID today at some point in the United States of America, and the bubble is rising, the curve is rising in Canada, and the military is being called in to assist with certain communities because the COVID reality has stressed everything to the breaking point. Dare we sing a song of joy and hope in the midst of that reality? And my friends, what I would say to us and to myself is, how dare we not? If there was ever a time when the world needed to hear our song of joy and hope and peace and love, it is this moment. We are fully immersed in the present reality. This is the moment to sing our Christmas carols as loudly and as boldly as we can. Sing them from the mountaintops. Sing them from our back decks. Sing them from our front doors. Sing them online. Sing them in person. Sing them however we can. Sing of hope and joy and peace and love. Because that's what it means to be embodied and enfleshed in this moment, walking alongside with God in this moment, engaging the present reality. So it's not about seeing in order to believe, but it's about believing in order to see. In that sense of faith and belief, we see the reality that is needed in the world, and out of our sense of faith, out of our grounding in the Christian tradition, out of our sense of the abundance of God's grace in our lives, we respond to that need. That's what it means to be an Advent people. That's what it means to be followers of Christ. That's what it means to not let fear dictate who we are. And so, like Scrooge, we begin to see a glimmer of what the Christmas spirit is really all about. And we begin to realize that the miracle of Christmas has just begun, has already begun in you and in me. Thanks be to God. Amen.